Okay, so I'm going to be talking about a model of human word prediction that, as it turns out, is not so great, but it's at least a start towards something better, I hope. Both the title and the abstract are highly misleading, and we'll get into exactly how as soon as we get to the results section. So first we'll talk about the goals of the model. We'll talk about the source of information for building the models. We'll talk about the actual method of prediction, and we'll talk about how we evaluate the model and what the results are of that evaluation. So humans, in case you haven't noticed, humans are always predicting words as they come up in the sentences that we're listening to or that we're reading. And there's all sorts of ways to know that we do that prediction, mostly by when we are surprised when our predictions don't come true. And that generates all sorts of cool waves in your brain that people look at, measure in all different sorts of ways, reaction time, etc. So we formalized this task with something called the close task, which is short for closure. And in this, so for this kind of model, we're doing a very specific subset of the close task, which is predicting the sort of rightmost word in the sentence. So we don't have a right context, only a left context for predicting it. And that's just sort of the way that online speech prediction works. So here's some examples. She could tell he was mad by the tone of his, and then you would guess voice, or at least 99% of the time you would guess voice. Then you've got sentences like Lois is taller than most, and that's slightly less predictable. So most people say girls, but there's also women or like basketball players, etc. So those are sort of exceptions. That's the sort of sentence that we'll be evaluating the model on, just because it sort of has more context than most prediction contexts do. There's also like super low context, predictability context. So if you hear the, you don't have a lot to go on. So it's hard to know what, you'd have just any noun or adjective would be there. And then there are misleading contexts, like while the baby bathed the baby, and you would probably, while the mother bathed the baby, and then you'd probably guess a noun phrase like she. While the mother bathed the baby, she, did this. But it could be the case that your syntactic-based predictions would be wrong, right? So you might get something like, while the mother bathed, comma, the baby spit up, basically. But you don't necessarily hear the comma in speech. Okay, so the goals, well, first of all, let's talk about briefly what people have done so far. So far, people have been using Ngrams, which is basically just a statistical measure of what words sort of go together in existing corpora of human writing and sometimes speech. And sometimes they add a syntactic component. Generally, it's just a hidden Markov model, so it's fairly basic and straightforward. The sources that I found said that they almost never include any kind of semantic component, because the kinds of semantic components that they've been able to produce are very expensive in terms of computation and very poor in terms of the overlap they give you in information. So they don't give you a whole lot on top of those other two things. But so what we're going to try and do is come up with a better semantic component to the prediction model that will, give a boost on top of those two things. And then we're also going to look a little bit about what at spoken versus written corpora as sources for that prediction. My intuition about it is that spoken corpora will be better because it's sort of, I don't know, writing is sort of artificial, and we probably hear more spoken words anyway, right? So that would be a greater source for our predictions. So the corpora I chose were the American National Corpus, the second edition. I used this for the Ngram component and the semantic component. So that it's about 20% spoken and 80% written. And the spoken portion is telephone conversations and in-person interviews. And the written component is sort of journals, newspapers, novels, all sorts of written material. And then for the syntactic element, I chose the third edition of the tree bank because I wanted to use a probabilistic context-free grammar and it's easier to build one of those if you have an already parsed source. There's significant overlap between these two corpora. The spoken component of the tree bank is sort of a subset of the spoken component of ANC. Okay, so I'm going to go over the Ngram portion in not too much technical detail, in the hope that those of you who are really interested in the details will already be familiar with it, and those of you who are not interested will not have to sit through all the technical mumbo-jumbo. So basically what I did was I took the ANC, and it's sort of, most of it is already separated into sentences, and the parts that weren't, I sort of had a basic heuristic to separate each line by sentences. And then on each end of those sentences, I added a beginning of string and end of string marker. Then I tokenized the text in the exact same way that the ANC does with its part of speech marking. And I deleted punctuation on the idea that you don't normally predict words by punctuation, which may or may not be true. I think you do use prosodic cues a little bit, but I didn't know how to formalize that based on punctuation. Okay, so for each 3-token sequence in the line, which is also a sentence, I iterate up a nested hash. So you've got, so say you had Lois is taller. So in the little part of the hash, the little data structure that stands for Lois followed by is followed by taller, you just add 1, right? And what that gets you is that now you can divide that by the number of times that any word followed Lois is, right? And so that gives you a sort of probability based on the context of Lois is for taller coming next. And then because you're unlikely to come up with most 3-word combinations, most words don't occur with each other, it's necessary to smooth in between to find sort of a value other than 0 for the probability of a given 3-word string. So the smoothing I used was modified Nezernay smoothing, which appears in Chen and Goodman, 1998. If you're curious about that, I've got reams of details about that. Okay, for the grammatical component, I used the probabilistic context-free grammar, as I mentioned. I started out doing a little bit of pre-processing on the tree bank. So what that amounted to was pruning the trees of traces and things that don't have sort of wouldn't have a physical form. And I got rid of disfluencies in speech because none of my data will have disfluencies in speech. So none of the evaluation data will have disfluencies in them. So I don't want people predicting those, or the model predicting those. I also binarized the trees. So this is to sort of make the prediction slightly more easy and to make the rules less sparse. So if you've got one rule that has 12 branches, you have the same problem as having your Ngrams, which is that most of those combinations won't occur more than once, if at all. So it's necessary to make the data sort of more simple to keep track of. And then I climbed through the trees that resulted of that binarization, and I did basically a similar thing to what I did with the Ngrams, which is I just sort of count the occurrences of, for example, alpha that goes to beta and alpha beta, right, and just count those. And then we calculate probabilities in basically the same way. Okay, so those two things are not really novel in word prediction, but this third thing is the novel part. So I used the Coles model, which was developed by Douglas Roda and colleagues. And I basically straight up followed all his suggestions for a corpus my size. So there isn't really much novel in the actual use of the method, but the application of the method is novel. So what I did was I tokenized the text pretty simply, just got rid of punctuation and cut along spaces. And then what you do is, within a given distance, for example, 4 words, I actually use 10 words because of the small size of the corpus, but within a certain window around any given word, you add points to a table. And so if 2 words occur right next to each other, they'll get a lot of points in the sort of intersection of the column and row for those 2 words. And if they occur farther away from each other, they'll get less and less points. So here's sort of what it would look like. So if you had the sentence, how is a raven like a writing desk, and you were accumulating the points for the word like, say the column like, then you would go to the row for how and add 1, go for the row for is and add 2, etc., etc. And you go through the whole corpus doing this. And then you take that giant table that you produced, and you convert those counts into correlations. And this is one of the major improvements of Cole's over the similar semantic vector algorithm called HAL, which is that words that occur very frequently, like is, are sort of thought to be more similar than everything because they co-occur with everything. But if you take the Pearson's correlation, you're only looking at the relative frequency. So does is occur more frequently with he, or does it occur more frequently with, elephant, something? So we sort of normalize all the table vectors so that we're only looking at relative frequency, relative co-occurrence. So then we set the negative correlations to 0 because knowing what words a word isn't related to is not really useful for guessing what a word is. And then we take the square root of all the values, which has the effect of accentuating small semantic relatedness values over large ones. And then we reduce the dimensionality. So if you have a column and row for every word in the corpus, that's very, very large. So not only is it hard to do computations over that amount, but also you get sort of a lot of noise, right? So what we do is, to reduce the dimensionality, we calculate what's called a singular value decomposition. And that sort of makes generalizations that are arbitrary. The system doesn't know anything about what the words actually mean, but it only sort of knows what sort of thing a word is likely to co-occur with. So the usefulness of this is that if two word vectors are sort of pointed in similar directions in multidimensional space, then it means that they'll have similar meanings. On the idea that, for example, if penguin and stork both occur in similar situations, along with words like nest or fly or feather or fish, then they are counted as more similar than, say, stork and potato, right? Okay. So here's how we get to the actual prediction. So now that we know our Ngrams, like how likely a sequence of words is, we take in our evaluation sentence that we're using to look at that we're trying to predict the next word of. We tokenize it as we did the corpus. We throw out all the punctuation, and we add a beginning of sentence tag like we did before. Then we look up the last two words in the Ngram hash. So we just look up those last two words, and then now we've got a list of likely words, right? Now we only have in the hash the list of words that actually occurred, right? So we have to figure out what the likelihood is of all the words that didn't occur. So that's what the smoothing was for. So we do that next. And then we add each of those candidates to a list by their value, by their likelihood, by their probability of occurring. So we only pick the top n, say the top 10 most likely words, and we add that to a candidate list. For the PCFG prediction, we tokenize the query sentence as before. Then we push a start symbol of the grammar onto a stack. This part gets a little bit complicated, but the basic idea is that we go through the rules, making up candidate trees for what could come next, right? And knowing what next word is in the query, we can sort of say what trees would meet that requirement, and we can list them in order of their probability. It's possible to almost eliminate all garden pathing if you have a large enough beam, that is, if you have a large enough number of candidates for your parse trees. But the fact is we don't really want to eliminate all garden pathing because humans are capable of having garden pathing. So we want to predict in the same way that humans do. So after we get to we go through each word this way, adding to the tree all the candidates, all the sort of candidate subtrees that could happen, and listing them in order of probability. And then we iterate once more, and then we sort of list the candidate words off in order of probability, and we add those to another candidate list, like we did with Ngrams. Okay, so now we get to the third module, the Coles module, and we tokenize the query sentence again. And then for each content word in the query, oh yes, 5 minutes, okay. So then for each content word in the query, we list the k nearest neighbors. So if you had dog, probably the top 5 ones would be something like dog, because it's identical. Then dogs, because it's very closely related. And then puppy, cat, etc., related words, right? So we get the k nearest neighbors, and we do that for each content word that appears in the query, right? And then there's a sort of tricky part, which is that we combine these neighbor lists. So if you've gotten the word dog and the word bone in the query sentence, then you find those candidate neighbors, and then you sort of combine the lists, and you order them according to what the lowest average distance away from the content words is. So what that has the effect of doing is finding the words that are sort of in between the words that you've seen so far, that have the most common meaning between all the ones that you've seen so far. And this does several things for us, but principal among them is getting rid of multiple meanings for a given word. So if you have a word like bank, it has like at least 2 major meanings, and which one it is can be disambiguated by the other words that occur in the sentence. So now we have 3 candidate lists, one for each of the components, and now we have to combine them into a master ranking. I didn't come up with a much better way of combining these than a sort of naive way, which is just sort of combining them by rank. So here's a way that it looks here. So if you have these 3 lists for your candidates, you sort of just add their ranks, for the rank for each list for each word together, and then now you have a new ranking, right, from lowest to highest number. So you see girl is the closest to high on all lists. So that's why girl ends up being first. In the case of a tie, the highest frequency word wins. Okay, so on to evaluation. So luckily someone did a lot of work for me by asking a bunch of college students to complete sentences. So here's some examples. This is from highest to lowest. So we saw the first example already. Confidence means the percent of people who gave that as their first choice. So people completed the first sentence with voice 99% of the time, whereas that bottom one, when the employee was hired, personnel began anew, it's kind of an awkward sentence, so only 17% of the time did they give job, and that's the highest ranked response. I call that the golden word. So each of those almost 500 sentences was sort of scored, was put through the predictor, and then a score was produced, which is the confidence divided by the rank of the golden word in the ranking that the list produced. So what this means is the more certain sentences, like that first sentence, will get you matter more than the sentences that are less predictable, right? Because humans predict them better. And then, so those will matter more. And then the higher in the ranking the right word is, the better your score, right? But this is kind of strict because if you predict every single word, but it's in second rank, it means you'll get a score that's only half of what it would be if it were in the top thing. And then we give an overall success score to the entire predicting model, which is just all the scores divided by the possible score. So that means that if you get the right word in second position all the time, then you will have a score of only 50%. So it's kind of stringent, but okay. So my hypothesis is that the Coles method should make this prediction better because semantics should make it better, right? The combined corpus, that is the corpus that uses both spoken and written subcorpora, should work the best. The spoken corpus should make a better model than the written corpus. And size matters. You want a larger corpus, so the largest corpus should win all the time. So, okay. So the first hypothesis, at least in the current model, is wrong. In fact, adding coals to the model made it much less successful. I think it might have something to do with how the rankings were combined. So it's clear that the hypothesis wasn't supported, but it's also just very low scores, not very good at prediction overall. But the problem is it's hard to know how this compares to existing word prediction models, because those are generally for things like cell phones or people who need assistive technology, and those generally it takes the first letter as granted. So it makes prediction much easier when you have that. It like narrows it down much better. So those systems are just going to be more successful anyway. So what went wrong? I already mentioned that I think the ranking algorithm might be too simplistic, but I'm still searching for a better combination algorithm. And then the obvious thing is that humans know about the world. So they know that diamonds and rings go together, for example, and they know they can sort of have a logical view of how things would be on top of each other, below each other, things like that. So their word prediction is going to be better overall. There are also some problematic assumptions of the current model. So I just mentioned that I assume no world knowledge. That's going to be difficult, right? So, but it's also going to be super difficult to get that kind of knowledge out of a corpus without human intervention. I assume that listeners don't know anything about the upcoming word, which Natasha's work has shown might not be a safe assumption. Sometimes you get co-articulation information about upcoming phonemes, so that might actually be a poor assumption. And I assume that syntactic-based expectations are sort of updated word by word, and that is probably true some of the time, but it's I've seen at least some work that suggests that it's not always true. Sometimes you need to get one phrase in before you know you're in a relative clause, for example. So that's probably a more complicated picture. Okay, I'm probably out of time, but if I okay, so just really quick. So spoken words have a different frequency distribution than written words. So if you look at the red versus the blue, sort of, it's a more curvy curve when you have spoken words. So the spoken corpus ended up being slightly better, marginally better than the written corpus for this word prediction. But I saw that using the whole corpus, using just more words, was a much bigger difference. So it turns out probably that even if you have to use only written words for word prediction, like for the corpus, it's probably better to do that and get a very large corpus than use a small corpus of written words. Okay, so in sum, semantic vectors may help word prediction, but not in this particular algorithm. Wasn't successful. And spoken corpora are better than written corpora, maybe, but larger is more important. Okay, I'd like to thank my committee and the faculty who helped me and my classmates who gave very good comments. Thank you.